this is the first day you've come to the conference, welcome to the conference. It's the second day, welcome back. Today we're going to be starting with a discussion about the sector itself and the reform of the not-for-profit sector, setting the national agenda. I suspect there's probably never been a more important time to actually have this discussion. There's been a significant amount of focus in the last couple of years and a fair bit of effort and investigation on this particular topic. I mean, most of you will be familiar with the Productivity Commission report that's been out for just over a year, which focused on the not-for-profit sector, issues to do with its viability, relationships of the not-for-profit sector with the community at large and certainly with government, the legal and regulatory framework in which the sector operates, and generally the not-for-profit sector's position within Australian society. And in many senses it set the scene, I think, for some of the reforms that have been looked at subsequently, and we've seen a number of those in the last year or so. We saw a lot of fanfare in terms of the launch of a national compact, a lot of fanfare in terms of the launch. I'm not entirely sure where it's gone since then. We might hear a little bit about that today. We've got a fairly significant discussion around the regulatory framework, and I know that at least one of our speakers no doubt will be actually talking to that, and there's been opportunities for this sector to respond to some of the proposals that have been put forward in terms of a new regulatory framework. I wanted to just reflect very briefly on the title of the topic itself, the reform of the not-for-profit sector. And for me it raises two very interesting questions. Reforms to what end? What are we trying to achieve with those reforms? But the second question is, who is responsible for the reforms? The title almost suggests that we're some sort of passive entity to be reformed, you know, waiting for some benevolent person or organisation or indeed a government to work out what's best in relation to the future of the not-for-profit sector, how we should be governed, how we should be managed, the sort of business we should be doing and how we actually undertake that business. Well, I have to say good luck to anyone who wants to actually impose that sort of an agenda on a sector that is, what, 600,000 organisations large, 10% of those being economically active organisations. It's an enormously diverse and large and growing sector. ACOSS's view is very clear. Reform needs to come effectively from within. The leadership really needs to be shown by our sector in terms of the reforms that need to be undertaken. And let's not kid ourselves, the sector has undergone reform throughout its history. We're no longer the sector that we were 30 years ago, 50 years ago, or go back further in time. We've morphed, we've changed, we've adapted to changing environments and conditions, and I think we've done it exceedingly well. Nonetheless, there are a number of quite important challenges that are before us at the moment, which we do need to be tackling. So, as we lead into this session, I guess what I'm keen to hear from our speakers today, and I don't wish to preempt what they have to say, but what I guess I'm keen to actually hear them touch on, at least in part, is the sorts of reforms that they believe need to be made which will strengthen, but not undermine, the independence of the not-for-profit sector, the sorts of reforms that will free the sector to apply its assets as being innovators, being connected to local issues and reflecting the mood and spirit of community members, of reforms that will reduce unnecessary burdens in reporting and accessing funds. I noted that the last Job Services Australia tender documentation, that was just to actually apply and get some money, it was 400 pages long. Not the sort of process which actually is particularly welcoming and is about reducing the burden and red tape on not-for-profit organisations. And finally, the sorts of reforms which will create a fairer and more consistent regulatory and legal framework in which the sector needs to operate.
So I did want to just focus a little bit on a fairly narrow band of what you might consider to be not-for-profit reform, and that is to focus on the issue of government contracting, because government contracting funds an enormous amount of our services. But I did want to make it clear at the outset that I don't consider not-profit reform to be just about government contracting. In fact, I think in one sense it's only a very small part. And I think the issues and challenges that Simon alluded to about what is the sector, what is civil society, How are consumers and carers engaged in these processes? What does our independence mean? How do we foster a civil society quite apart from government contracting are absolutely and fundamental questions, but we probably don't have time to consider all of them this morning, though my other presenters may deal with some of that. And the thought that I brought to the issue of government contracting is that I'm sure you, like me, in the third sector, feel that there just simply hasn't been enough research or hasn't been enough investigation of what's required to assist the third sector. Is that a fairly commonly held view? I didn't think so. I guess my basic premise in relation to all of this third sector reform, and particularly in relation to government contracting, on the back of that, I accept it's a straw poll, but I think our numbers are pretty indicative here. My basic premise is that government fundamentally just does not pay its way. That one of the core problems that we have is we hear government talking about supporting the sector. We don't hear governments talking about actually paying their way for the services that they're asking us to deliver. And I think that if we ignore that, I know that's not all it is, but if we ignore that, then I think it's going to continue to be a great challenge for us. So we're locked in a political cycle that I think makes it very hard for governments to plan beyond that political cycle. So to actually invest and to look ahead and to say, all right, what is the community going to need in this space in the next 10 or 20 years, I think is an enormous challenge, and it will be an enormous challenge for any government. Some of you will know that before the Productivity Commission inquiry, Catholic Social Services conducted a survey of its members that I think is likely to be pretty typical of many of your agencies too. And we found that 19 of our member agencies, so that's 19 of our member agencies, were in 620 different contracts with state and federal government to provide what you could only describe as a sort of pretty generic range of social and community services. Very few of them in long contracts, and very few of them in contracts that allow a broad range of services. So what we're seeing is our agency, or first off, we're seeing government who's in receipt of funding, dividing that funding up into a whole heap of different buckets, from our perspective 40 or 50 different buckets that our agencies then have to come along to and draw water from each of those buckets and bring it back to their agency and then try and reconstruct it into an integrated service. And I think that's fundamental to our challenge. So for mine, the challenge of not-for-profit reform, particularly as I say as it relates to government funding and services, is actually about government reform. It's actually about reforming all of that funding environment that sees funding divided up into silos and managed in silos between levels of government, including the Commonwealth and state governments. So much of the reform agenda really, in my view, has to happen at COAG and at that level, and we really need to see very substantial reform. I'd leave my thoughts really with two brief thoughts. One is that we're coming up to I think we've either coming up to or just past the 12-month anniversary of the compact. As Simon said, it was launched with much fanfare, and I think we're yet to see, for a range of reasons, we're yet to see that implemented. My own view was that the sentiment of the compact, the sentiments expressed about partnership and collaboration and certainty for the sector, are warm and welcome aspirations, and there would be very little argument except at the fringes about how to apply some of that. But we're not yet seeing how that's implemented in practice. Why have we been complicit in allowing this situation to develop? Why have we accepted funding on terms that are unfair? Why are we taking funding from our donors and from our supporters and from our investments and supplementing government programs? Why don't we yet have a voice like, for instance, the Business Council of Australia or some of those groups that we hear about all the time? We're a sector larger, I think, by many measures than the retail sector. We're a sector that's far more important to the life of society, and yet, again, we're getting to our dirty washing now, and yet we're not able, I don't think, to negotiate on behalf of our services and on behalf of the people that we provide those services to with the strength of voice that is required to overcome some of these other challenges. Thanks.